week ago, the pastor came to me and says, I can't find anybody to preach on this Sabbath. Would you be willing to? I says, you know, Pastor, I really don't have the time to put a sermon together and be prepared to do the job right. And he said, well, why don't you just dig out one of your old ones, update it, and dust it off? And I said, well, I think I can probably do that. And I got to thinking about the file that I had of the sermons I've given. And this sermon I'm going to present this morning is one I gave here in 2006. Most of you probably won't remember it, which is a good thing. But it's as equally important today, if not more so, than at the time that I gave it. I feel very strongly about the subject of the sermon today, is whether we're ready for Jesus to come. And I think that if we stop and look, we can determine that we probably need to be preparing a little more than we are. So with that said, let's proceed. We as Seventh-day Adventists have been looking for the second coming of Christ since the beginning of our church. It was one of the things that our church was based on. It's part of the name of our church, the Adventists. And the advent of Christ's coming is what we're looking for. Years ago, we had a few years ago, let's say, we had a gentleman in our church here that had studied the end-time events exhaustively in both the Bible and Mrs. White. And on Sabbath afternoon, he would hold classes at his home, and there was a number of us that went up there. And this was back in the early 80s, and we felt that there was no way that this world could last until the 2000s. And we were looking for the Lord to come imminently at that point. And here we are in 2015, and he still hasn't come. Maybe we haven't done our part. Maybe he is waiting for that one individual that needs to be part of the remnant people that go to heaven. I can well remember as a youngster, 7, 8 years old, sitting in the old Tacoma Park Seventh-day Adventist Church and listening to Brother Wilcox preach about the second coming. And listening to him preach, I had the feeling that I would never have a chance to grow up. I would never have a chance to finish school. I would never have a chance to get married and have children, and much less grandchildren. And yet, my grandson, there's a junior in academy, is sitting in the back of the church. And, you know, he believed and he taught that the Lord was coming soon. And he made us believe that the Lord was coming soon. And yet, it hasn't happened. He was able to paint a word picture of what we were going to be facing. I remember sitting in church and wondering if I would be able to see the little cloud the size of a hand in the eastern sky. I can remember wondering if I would hear the Lord announce the date and the hour of his coming. I haven't heard it yet. I certainly hope that I will, but we never know. I remember seeing him standing there, and He seemed truly ancient to me as a child at 7 or 8. I suppose he was probably in his late 50s at that time. What does that say about me? But, you know, the point is, we have been preaching this, but it has not happened. And we wonder why. We need to be ready as if the Lord was coming tomorrow. We can't say, well, he's coming next week, or next month, or next year, or 10 years from now. We need to think and act as if tomorrow were the day, or even this afternoon. I fully believe that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the church spoken of in Daniel and Revelation. And I believe that our church will go through and will be taken to heaven. And I want to be part of it. I would like to change direction just a little bit. And we're going to look at a date that was the resurrection plus 40 days. The place is on the road from Jerusalem to Mount Olivet. The disciples had just had 40 days with Jesus since the crucifixion and the resurrection. Jesus had spent his time working with the disciples, trying to prepare them for what was coming. And even the disciples that were as close to Jesus as you could be didn't fully understand what was coming. You can tell that by the questions that they asked. Lord, are you going to set up your kingdom now? And he would give them an answer that didn't fully answer the question, but would make them think. Jesus was probably the only earthly being at that time that knew the day that his time on earth was going to end. And as they were walking and talking, Jesus told the disciples that they were to go and tell the word, the good news. They needed to spread the gospel news that he indeed had come, that he had indeed lived among them, had been crucified and resurrected. And he was coming back. And he was going to take the people of this earth home with him. Let's turn to Acts 1, verses 6 to 11, and take a look and see what Jesus told his followers and how he was going to be taken from them. Therefore, when they had come together, they asked him, saying, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put in his own authority, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And then Jesus ascended. He was taken from them. Can you imagine being there with Jesus on that road? And he is telling you about what is going to happen. And all of a sudden, he is surrounded by the angels, and they are lifting him up. And you're standing there watching him go. Can you imagine the loss that you would have felt at that time? But it wasn't just the disciples that felt the loss. It was the rest of his followers also. Imagine, if you can, seeing the cloud of angels envelop Jesus, God's only Son, and welcoming him home to heaven where he had been absent for these 30 years. I can imagine the joy in heaven was overwhelming. They had a party, they end all parties, I'm sure. I'm sure that there's been a major void in heaven while Christ was on the earth. And he was fulfilling the plan that the Godhead had put together prior to the time that this earth was created. However, I am ever so thankful that he was willing to do this for us, the fallen people. Without his gift of his death and his resurrection, we would have no hope. But we have this tremendous hope that we will be able to live eternally.
Amen.
When the disciples had asked Jesus about his return, he had told them that they needed to study. And in Matthew 24, he foretold of many tragedies to come. And when he was asked about specific signs of his imminent return, and I'm certain that Jesus didn't want to scare the disciples with the things that were going to be coming. But he also needed to have them have some idea of what to expect. You know, you can do anything if you know what to expect. It's when you are surprised that you really don't have the ability to cope with situations. There's a whole list of things that were going to happen between the time that Christ ascended and the time that he would come again. And for the next few minutes, I would like to dwell on a few of those. I'm not going to hit all of them. But there is, in Matthew 24:29, there is a number of things spoken of. There's the tribulation that is spoken of in the text. And it is what we have referred to as the Dark Ages. Mrs. White tells us that even with all the persecution that went on during the Dark Ages, there was always faithful followers that kept the faith and carried the gospel forward. The end of time, or the last days, started at the end of the 1260-day prophecy. Mrs. White tells us that this happened in 1755 with the opening of the sixth seal of prophecy, and that this would happen just before the second coming of Christ. On November 1, 1755, the Great Lisbon earthquake. History tells us that in just a few minutes, approximately 10 minutes, that a third of the population of Lisbon was killed. It was a city of about 250,000 people. So that meant about 80,000 people died just boom, gone. That would mean that a group of people of about twice the size of Grand Junction died in 10 minutes. Think about that. Those people never had a chance. That's kind of hard to wrap my mind around. The earthquake that shook Lisbon at that time, it was reported to be, in today's standards, of about a 9 points on the Richter scale. No earthquake of this scale had happened in the world prior to that time. The Great Controversy on page 305 gives quite a picture of this tragedy. November 1 was the All Saints' Day. It was a pagan holiday. The churches were and the convents were totally packed with people. And when the earthquake struck, the churches and convents collapsed. Lisbon was a little bit like Babel in some ways. They had constructed a quay in the harbor there that they had bragged that not even God could destroy. And a lot of people, when the earthquake started, ran out onto this quay because they felt it was a safe place. And at the time of the earthquake, this quay totally disappeared, along with all the people that were on it. There was never a body found of the people that were on that. These were people that their time had come. They had not a second chance. They were not ready. We need to be ready on a daily basis. Tragedy can strike us at any time. It was brought to my mind this week. I was listening to one of the radio programs, and they were talking about what was happening in the Middle East. And about 300 Christians a month are being beheaded in the Middle East at this point. And the Muslim, the radical Muslims have said, and they said this week, that they are going to take over the world, and you have two choices. You'll either become a Muslim or you become dead. That's the only option. So that tells me that things are going to be wrapping up very quickly. It is not something that we can say is going to happen in a few years. I think it's going to happen a lot sooner than that. I believe that the Lisbon earthquake was one of the first signs of the end times. Mrs. White confirms that this is true. The next sign that was foretold occurred 25 years later, May 19, 1780. That was when the sun was darkened. And the moon, it was darkened at noon, and there has never been a scientific explanation of what has happened. Some people have postulated that there was smoke, that there was a major eruption of a volcano and it blocked out the sun. But there is no record in history of that having transpired. The sun just went dark. That was of the Lord's doing, I'm sure. In some areas of New England at that time, when the sun was dark, they could see stars shining brightly. So, it wasn't smoke that was blocking out the sun. Because if it was, then you couldn't see the stars. So the sun just was not shining. In the Boston area, the darkness continued for 14 or 15 hours. Total darkness. There was no ray of light able to penetrate the darkness. That's a darkness that you could only find in caves. And then about midnight, the darkness was lifted, the moon came out. But the moon was not normal that night. It was a brilliant red. It looked as if blood were covering the moon. In Joel chapter 2, verse 31. The prophet wrote, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord's coming." That was in 1780 that happened. We are now in 2015. That's over 300 years. We've been tarrying a long time. The next sign came 53 years later. This was the falling of the stars, which occurred on November 13, 1833. A writer for the Boston paper wrote, "For nearly 4 hours, the sky was so bright, one could read the newspaper by the light generated." You know, we've had meteor showers in my lifetime, but they were not anywhere near that bright. That had to have been quite a spectacular meteor shower. How could anyone deny that this was a sign from the Almighty? Yet scientists try and say that it was just an occurrence that happened from debris from a comet or a star breaking up. In a recent scientific journal, and this goes back to 2006, the scientists are predicting a falling of the stars in October of 2006 that was going to be almost as bright as what happened then. That didn't happen. The scientists go on to say that religious leaders putting any prophetic significance to the phenomenon of 1833 is absurd. I don't believe that. I believe the Lord prepared the sky to show what he wanted it to show. In Daniel 12, verse 4, Daniel foretells of the explosion of knowledge. Has this old world had an explosion of knowledge? I can remember as a young man, the biggest airplane that we had was a DC-3. And I remember the first ride I had on a DC-3, and I thought that was the greatest thing. There was 19 of us on that plane, and it was full. Now we have the Dreamliner that holds 600 or 700 people flying. We have computers, we have cell phones, we have just since 2006 when I did this before, we have got iPads now. Nobody uses a desktop computer to speak of anymore. Most of it is either a laptop or iPads or something like that. And the amount of knowledge that we can carry around in our cell phones alone is many times greater than the computing power that was on the first spaceship that went to the moon. Many times more, and we carry it in our pocket. Knowledge is increasing. Technology is taking over the world. We have also seen a marked growth in the understanding of the Bible. Things when I was a child back in the early 50s, we had no knowledge. We didn't understand what the Bible was telling us. Yet today we fully understand that. And I believe that there is more understanding that will be coming from the Bible as time goes along. We don't know everything yet, but the Lord is providing the knowledge to us. We have, with the help of writers like Mrs. White, biblical scholars such as James White, Joseph Bates, William Miller, a much better understanding of Daniel and Revelation than people had prior to their being involved with the study of the Bible. In Daniel and Revelation, it says these prophecies will be sealed until the end time. Those seals have been broken. We are learning about the differences about what the Bible is telling us. Things that people did not understand before are no longer mysteries. Jesus told us at the time that he was taken from us that the gospel would be preached to all the world and then the end would come. It has been claimed that this prophecy was fulfilled in 1997. However, in 2005, there was a small town in West Virginia that was back in the coal mining area that had never heard of the message of the gospel. And as communications improve, there's other places in the world that we're hearing about every day that have never heard the gospel. So the gospel is still going. We have done some things in this valley here that have improved the knowledge of the gospel in the last year. We are reaching into places that have not been reached before with the message from our radio station, which broadcasts from upstairs here in the church. So, we think we have the answers. We don't. Every day the Lord shows us that, yes, we're getting closer, but you haven't got all the answers yet. The medical community is constantly worried about some overseas traveler bringing an uncurable disease home with. This has been one of the things that we have been fighting this last year is the Ebola outbreak in the world. It is, again, telling us that we are living in the end time. We don't have the control that we thought we had. Only the Lord is in control.
Right.
We hear every day about some Hollywood actor, some politician that is in touch with a seer or is involved with spiritualism. And we are looking every day at an increase of spiritualism. And Mrs. White tells us that in the last days that spiritualism will be one of the things that we're having to fight constantly. And if you watch any TV, you watch any movies, there is always spiritualism in the TV and the movies. Are we getting close to the end of time? I believe we are. I believe the Lord is going to be coming a lot sooner than any of us feel. We hear every day of a psychic that is helping the police in discovering a crime, solves a crime. This is again the devil working through these people to make it look like he is a good person. We hear all the time about, it used to be global cooling, and it became global warming, and now it's climate change. They don't know what's happening. And if we go to Testimonies, Volume 6, page 408, Mrs. White tells us that the restraining spirit of God is even now being withdrawn from the world. Hurricanes, storms, tempests. I read in the paper yesterday about this volcano that has never erupted in the last 500 years it suddenly erupted. In Chile, yes. And it is spewing great amounts of ash into the sky, and they have no idea when it's going to stop, if it's going to stop. Again, more signs that the Lord is coming soon. In Testimonies, Volume 9, page 14, and please remember that this was written over 100 years ago. Mrs. White tells us, the world is stirred of a spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. And this was written over 100 years ago. And we're still here. What do we hear about every day? We hear about war. We hear rumors of war. We hear of atrocities that are being done. There is no hope for this world other than through Christ. And we need to remember that Christ is our leader. Christ is the only one that we can depend on. I believe that today we are standing on the very brink of eternity. I believe very soon we will step out of the space between Revelation 6:13 and the verse and the events that take place in verse 14. We will no longer be living in that space, but will step into the final moments of sin's long reign. God will come. He will take his faithful members home. And I want to be part of that group. And I would hope that everyone else here today will be part of that group also. The closing song is hymn 213. Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen.